This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states. Hello and welcome to This Day from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 13th, 1846, a young black and Native American man named William Freeman is arrested for the murder of 4 white people in Cuyahoga County, New York. A number of years earlier, Freeman had been imprisoned in Auburn Prison in upstate New York for stealing a horse, a charge that he denied. Auburn was one of the first for-profit prisons in the United States, and Freeman and other inmates suffered deep abuse, physical and psychological, while imprisoned. After Freeman was released, he spent months trying to advocate for reform of the prison and gain back wages for the time that he was incarcerated. And then, this moment that we're marking this day in 1846, he commits the murder that we are going to discuss. And it's a murder that, in some ways, he resorted to in order to try and make a statement or get payback against the state in some way. It is a very sordid, complicated tale, but one that illuminates the roots of a very broken prison system that we live with today. Here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode, Robin Bernstein, history professor at Harvard and author of the book Freeman's Challenge, which is all about the William Freeman case. Robin, thank you for doing this. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much for having me.
We see the cover over your left shoulder, and it is beautiful. Great job, whoever worked on that. We're big fans of striking covers on this podcast. Right. Obviously, we want to paint a sketch of who William Freeman was, talk about his actions, but gosh, I'll say maybe my first reaction, a lot of listeners' first reaction is there were private prisons in the 1840s?
Yeah, there actually were not private prisons. What there were was for-profit prisons. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the really important distinctions that I'm making in the book. We have this idea that when we think of a for-profit prison, that is by definition a private prison, and private prisons are an invention of the 20th century. So I really want to expand the definition. This is one of the interventions I'm trying to make. My perspective is that if you have a prison that was established for the purpose of turning profits, and it was run for the purpose of making profits, that is a for-profit prison.
That is sound.
That sounds right.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me too. Yeah.
Who gets the profit?
Yeah.
Well, in the case of the Auburn State Prison, it was a whole lot of white people, basically. But it was also a little more complicated than that. So the way the Auburn State Prison worked, this was the first prison that really was established for the purpose of creating profits. So this was 1816 in New York State, central New York State, Finger Lakes area. And there was a group of white businessmen who got what was then a radical idea, and that was to build a prison in their tiny little village for the express purpose of transforming the local economy. Prior to this, prisons existed for some combination of 3 reasons. They existed to punish people, or they existed to control people, basically to get them off the streets, or they existed to reform people and often to Christianize people. But the state of New York at the time was offering a contract of $20,000, which is the equivalent of about $500,000 today, to any vicinity that would build a prison for the purpose of punishment, control, and reformation. At the time, Auburn was a tiny little village of about 2,000 people. And these white businessmen had the insight that if you take a little village of 2,000 people and you flood it with the equivalent of $500,000, with more money to come every year in perpetuity, that is going to completely transform the local economy. So that's what they did. And so when you in response to your question, who profited? Well, first of all, these white businessmen profited. So to give you one example, one of them, their business was real estate. And the prison multiplied the value of his real estate and made him extremely wealthy. So he's one example of somebody who profited. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just people getting super wealthy. Auburn became a kind of one company town.
Yeah.
So actually, everybody profited in one way or another. Everybody was economically entangled with this town. Every family was somehow dependent on this prison. And so what you had was a small number of people making massive profits, but a very large number of people making small but regular and dependable sums of money. And that, of course, purchased consent.
Yeah.
So you have this $20,000 that's coming in as the prison is getting set up. But from what I understand, there was also another form of income coming to this prison, and that was using and selling the labor of the people who were imprisoned. How did that develop? Was that unusual? Was this something that was pretty normal, but it was just folded into the for-profit model? Like, how did that labor work?
Yeah. So it basically was convict leasing. I mean, that's what it was. So these white businessmen, they get the idea to like suck this money out of the state for the purpose of transforming Auburn from a village into a city. But then they get this second idea, exactly as you said, which was to build the prison itself on the banks of a river with a swift current. This is the Owasco River. So they deliberately build the prison on the banks of this river for the purpose of capturing water power, for the purpose of powering factories that will be built into the prison. And I actually have the deed. The deed for the land actually states this explicitly. So the idea that there would be modern industrial factories inside the prison, that was part of the concept literally before the first stone was laid. Now, it wasn't unheard of to have factories inside a prison. That did happen before this. But what made this unique was the fact that the factories were there not for the purpose of punishing or controlling or reforming people. This was not for the purpose of teaching vocational skills. This was not for the purpose of preventing idleness, for example, which is how some other prisons thought about factory work. This was just baldly for the purpose of making profits. And so what happened was the prison created these factories, and then private companies leased the prisoners' labor. They leased it usually for 35 cents per man per day, and all of the workers were men. The prisoners were forced to work 12 hours a day, for which they received no compensation at all. And I really want to emphasize that. No wages, no special privileges, no early release, literally nothing. 12 hours a day. And they were called literally the slaves of the state. So this was a way that New York State was creating a new form of slavery, carceral slavery, with the same many of the same logics of chattel slavery in 1816, which is the exact moment of gradual emancipation in New York State. So basically, as chattel slavery was phasing out in New York State invented this new form of slavery, which was carceral slavery.
This just blows my mind in a lot of ways because, I mean, I talk about this a lot in my classes, but in a 20th and 21st century sort of context where you still today have towns that literally operate around the prison. The prison is the factory, and everyone is either a parole officer or a security officer or has some sort of employment that's tethered to that particular prison. But thinking about 200 years earlier, that this model is sort of not only being created, but also inspiring others to do this in other places, that other cities will pick up this model as well, is just sort of, you get to see really the roots, the insidious roots of how this plays out. And I guess my question is sort of like, is this are all of the people who are enslaved to this prison, are they all Black? Are they white? What is sort of the makeup of them? Are people being incentivized to recruit prisoners in some sort of sense, incentivized to sort of like police people that they can also put in this prison?
Yeah, this was a really important question for me as I was writing this book. And as far as I can tell, the very first group of prisoners in the Auburn State Prison were 100% white. So, which again speaks to the fact that the goal was to enslave people, and they didn't actually care so much who they were enslaving. They wanted the labor. It was really about extracting the labor. So initially, it was not a racist project. It was a capitalist project that was not centering racism. But that does not mean in any way that it was an anti-racist project, because it most certainly was not.
No.
And what happened was, once this thing was built, and once you had white people being forced to labor inside the Auburn State Prison, then it very quickly became a way to enslave Black people and to re-enslave Black people. So it was built not for the purpose of re-enslaving Black people, but that is how it was used. Once this thing existed, it was available for that purpose. So 1816, as far as I can tell, 0% white prisoners. By the time William Freeman was imprisoned in 1840, it was 1 in 9 prisoners were Black. So that's about 11%. And to give you context, New York State at the time was about 2% Black. So you have a gross overrepresentation of Black people in the prison by 1840. And now, of course, today, Black and brown people comprise approximately 75% of the people incarcerated in New York State. So this was a very powerful and important and increasing tool of racism.
I'm David Remnick, host of the New Yorker Radio Hour. There's nothing like finding a story you can really sink into that lets you tune out the noise and focus on what matters. In print or here on the podcast, the New Yorker brings you thoughtfulness and depth and even humor that you can't find anywhere else. So please join me every week for the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
A quick word about Up First from NPR. Breaking news, as you've probably noticed, is pretty broken. You're constantly doom scrolling on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it, and maybe you feel a little bit of, I'm over it, I'm over the news. Well, if this sounds like you, I recommend that you listen to the Up First podcast from NPR. You get everything you need to know in an easy 15-minute update. Look, if you listen to this show, it is very likely that you follow the news and you care about politics, just like me. But I think one of the best choices you can make is decide how to engage with the news. And Up First is a perfect way to distill down to just the information you need to help you understand the news without getting overwhelmed and feeling that sense of news paralysis. Up First is national and international. There's facts and information, but there's also personality and analysis. Start your day every day with Up First. Change the way that you consume the news. Listen now to the Up First podcast from NPR. This episode is brought to you by Quince. Folks, it is officially time to start thinking about refreshing your wardrobe for the spring. Maybe even leveling up with a little affordable luxury. Well, Quince is here to help. Quince offers a range of high-quality items at prices within reach. I'll tell you the section of Quince that I'm most excited about, which might tell you something about where my head's at. There's a section on the site called The Vacation Shop. I just ordered a new pair of sunglasses from there. They have an Italian leather sling for under $100, hats, cases, even luggage if you want. I have made a vow to travel in linen and only linen, so I've stocked up on a couple European utility shirts, $45, that's it. And a new pair of nice-looking board shorts, $40. So I am all set for my summer travels. If you've got your eye on all the fun that comes with warm weather, go ahead and give Quince a shot. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping, 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
Robin, you mentioned William Freeman, and I wonder if we can turn to his story now and his experience in this prison. We know that they were laboring for 12 hours a day, but what was the sort of fullness of his personal experience in the prison?
Yeah. So William Freeman was this amazing person. And once I learned about who he was, I just got more and more entranced with what he had to say. He had something very important to say. So William Freeman was an African American and also Native American teenager. He was 15 years old. He grew up in Auburn just by coincidence. He happened to be born there. He was born into the most prominent Black family in town. So his grandparents, who had been enslaved, had actually been brought to Auburn forcibly, and they had been forced to build White Auburn on land that had been very recently seized from the Cayuga Nation. So his grandparents, as enslaved people, had been forced to build White Auburn, but while they were doing that, they also established Black Auburn. They established the Black neighborhood in Auburn, which was called New Guinea. And then so they, over time, they became free. William Freeman's father, James, had been born enslaved, but he became free. William Freeman's mother was always free. So William Freeman was born free. And I think it's really important to note that this is a family that as they became free, as they struggled into freedom over several decades, which is how gradual emancipation was designed to work. As they struggled to freedom over decades, everybody in this family chose to name themselves Freeman. And I think that matters a lot. That tells us a lot about what this family valued, how they thought about themselves, what they cared about. And so Freeman was part of the first fully free generation in his family and one of the first fully free generations in New York State. And he had, in some ways, a really hard life. He was working from an early age. The family was not wealthy. But he had, in a lot of ways, a really good life. He was part of this loving family, and he was part of a vibrant community where his family was particularly respected and cared for. But everything changed for William Freeman when he was 15. As you said, he was accused of stealing a horse. There was no hard evidence against him, but it didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. So here he is. He's part of the first fully free generation in his family. He's always been free. He's named Freeman. He goes into the Auburn State Prison, and he's told, "You are now a slave of the state." And William Freeman was furious. And he resisted. And that's really what the book is about. It's about his resistance. The full title of the book is Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. That is what William Freeman did. He shook this behemoth that was powering the economy of not only Auburn by that time, but all of New York State.
One of the details that I was really struck by was that it wasn't just that they were forced to labor on behalf of the state and on behalf of these companies, but that they were forced to be silent all the time.
Yes.
That they couldn't talk when they worked. Yeah. That they were put in solitary confinement after. That they faced violence as part of the punitive system within the prison. It was incarceration, which itself is horrific, and it was enslavement, which is also horrific. And then there is this kind of psychological torture on top of it.
Dehumanizing. I mean, it's dehumanizing because it's one thing to do hard labor. I'm not trying to diminish the labor, but to treat someone as though they are not at all a human being, to deny them language, to deny them community, to deny them really anything that you talked about that would reform or sort of repair or get them, on solid footing again. None of that happens.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And that really reveals what this prison was actually about, because you're exactly right. Forced silence and solitary confinement, let's name it very explicitly, these are tortures. So when William Freeman entered at the age of 15, he was basically told, you are not going to speak another word until you are 20. And it is so difficult to take that in. Every prisoner was put into solitary confinement every night. And then during the day, they were marched into these factories where they worked together, but in total silence. Total silence during meals, total silence while marching, total silence at all times. And speaking a single word, a single whisper, resulted in immediate beating. So what's so important about this is, first of all, to comprehend it, from a human perspective, what it must have been like to suffer this, but also to think about what was the purpose of it. Why do this? The purpose was not punishment. The purpose was productivity. The purpose was to prevent worker solidarity, to prevent workers from organizing. Because when you think about it, to force a human being to work 12 hours a day, every single day, for no compensation of any kind, how do you do that? There's really only two ways in any form of slavery. This is slavery. And in any form of slavery, there's really only two ways to accomplish that. And one is through extreme violence, and the other is through extreme social control. And the silence was about social control. That was the purpose. And so that is what William Freeman was subjected to. And William Freeman, one of the very first things he did when he got into the prison was speak. He told his jailers that he did not want to work because he had, for two reasons. One was that he had committed no crime, and the other was that he deserved to be paid for his work. He did not want to work for no pay because he was a citizen. He was a free person. He was not a slave of the state in his self-conception. And so he spoke up, and the retribution was immediate and terrible. And he continued to speak up and resist the Auburn State Prison.
So let's advance this to the moment we're marking now, which is William Freeman has been out for a number of months. I think, as we've described, he suffered a good amount of physical and psychological abuse, and I would say psychological deterioration over the course of his time in prison. He's now out for a few months. On March 12th, he goes to the house of the Van Nest family, and I'll tell you, I had to kind of really watch my framing of this in the intro, and I'm very curious to hear kind of how you think of it. But, he attacks and kills Sarah Van Nest outside of her home, and then her husband, John, runs to her aid, and Freeman stabs her and kills her. Then Freeman goes into the house and kills Sarah's mother and their child. And then another guest of the home fights him off and is injured but escapes. These facts aren't in dispute. This man murdered this family. Random family? Did he know the Van Nests?
He knew them very slightly. But they had no connection to his incarceration. They had no connection to the accusation against him of horse theft. So although he knew them slightly, it was basically a random murder. And I want to just back up just a little bit to explain this murder that happened on March 12th of 1846. When he got out of prison in September of 1845, his perspective was that 5 years of his labor had been stolen from him by the state. The state owed him back wages for 5 years of labor. That was his position. And as far as he was concerned, the state had committed a crime against him. So what he did was he went to magistrates and he went to lawyers trying to get somebody to take up his case against the state. He even went to William Henry Seward, who at the time was the two-time recent governor of New York State. He went to William Henry Seward to ask him to help him recuperate these back wages that, in his view, the state owed him. And he was dismissed and he was laughed at. And then at a certain point, he realized he wasn't going to get justice, that the theft was total and it wasn't going to be remediated. And at that point, he converted his goal from back pay to payback. And what's really important is that, of course, he could have gone after the judge who sentenced him. He could have gone after the people who accused him of the horse theft. He could have gone after the guards who beat him in prison. He didn't do any of that. He went after a random white family. And my interpretation of that is that this was basically an act of terrorism. That the reason that it was so alarming, so disruptive to the system was that it couldn't be easily explained away. I mean, if he had gone and told the judge, that would have been, sensational. It would have been fascinating. It would have been perhaps frightening. But there's a limit to how frightening it would be to bystanders. Because, why did William Freeman kill the judge and not me? Well, there's an easy answer for that. But he denied the public that kind of easy narrative. Why did he kill the Van Nest family and not me? There was no reason. There was no reason at all. His real target, and he said this explicitly, his real target was the state. And his real target was the entire community that was benefiting economically from the Auburn State Prison. And that was mainly white people, but not only white people. So this was part of the reason that his challenge to the Auburn State Prison really made the system shake, because it was so terrifying, not despite being a random group of victims, but because they were a random group of victims.
And this is why revenge is not really a useful word in a sense, in terms of like it would have been revenge if we're talking about sort of the jailer or the judge or the people that are responsible for his incarceration. But I'm trying to figure out what would be the best way to encapsulate, if not revenge, is this some sort of, I mean, we would say today like sticking it to the man, but that doesn't feel, I don't know, I guess comprehensive enough in terms of what he was trying to achieve. But it is quite interesting that that's how he chose to address his grievances.
Yeah. I mean, I thought a lot about the word revenge when I was writing this book. At the time, white people used the word revenge a lot to describe his act. They wanted to diminish it. They wanted to control the terror that he had unleashed. And a narrative of revenge would have been easier for white people to deal with at the time. And interestingly, in the days after the murder, a rumor circulated that John Van Nest, one of the victims, had been involved in the horse theft trial, which wasn't true, but they wanted it to be true because that would have been so comfortable. So white people use the word revenge a lot, but William Freeman never did. And to me, that's really important. So for me, the word that most accurately describes the dynamic is terrorism. And I say that not to apologize for terrorism, but to explain why this was effective. I mean, what we know about terrorism is that it terrorizes people. And what William Freeman did was extremely effective at terrorizing people. When I think about what to constellate this event with, I sometimes think about Nat Turner's rebellion. And one of the factors that made Nat Turner's rebellion so terrifying to white people was the fact that his rebels did not only kill enslavers.
Yeah, they killed children.
They killed children. And William Freeman killed a child. And so we can't reduce Nat Turner's rebellion to revenge. And similarly, we cannot and should not reduce William Freeman's rebellion to revenge.
Okay, everyone, we are going to leave it there for part 1 of our conversation with Robin Bernstein with this larger question of how to describe William Freeman's murders and how to think of his act in context. I'll tell you that when we started recording this conversation, we were just going to do it as one episode on the shorter side like we usually do. And then as it went on, I said, you know what, we're going to make this a 2-parter. There is so much here in this story. So next episode, we will pick it back up and find out what happens to Freeman, the ripple effects of the murders on the anti-slavery movement, the prison system, and of course the many lessons and resonances for how we should think about violence and terrorism and prisons today. So we'll be back with part 2 on Thursday. For Niki Hemmer and Kellie Carter-Jackson, my name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.